And we are live on YouTube.
Welcome, everyone. This is our program called How Do You Say Bravo in Yiddish? Italian Opera for the Yiddish-Speaking Masses in Early 20th Century America, a 5-part lecture series featuring the research of Daniela Smolev-Levy. We are so excited tonight since this will conclude our 5-part series and we have another guest with us. Before I do the introductions, let me just say that we welcome everyone to the Lowell Milken Center for Music of American Jewish Experience, and we hope that you'll look on our website for more programs that are upcoming in the future. Firstly, I wanted to thank the supporters of this event. This event is made possible by the generous support of the David Victor Foundation, and our thanks also go to our co-sponsors, to YIVO, the California Institute for Yiddish Culture and Language, the UCLA Alan D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies, the Jewish Music Forum, and the Dybbuk Project at the University of Haifa. And we're grateful for this collaborative venture to help get the word out on this very important event. Our main presenter tonight is Dr. Daniela Smolev-Levy. She is a musicologist as well as a pianist. She received her doctoral degree at Stanford University, where she looked at the aspect of exploring democracy in American opera, and the research that she's doing regarding Yiddish theater is a part of that work. At present, she teaches at the University of Southern California, and in addition, she is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Haifa for their Dybbuk project. After she presents tonight, we are really pleased to have a very distinguished scholar, Professor Mark Slobin, who is the Winslow Kaplan Professor of Music Emeritus at Wesleyan University and the author or editor of many books and articles on Afghanistan, in Central Asia, Eastern European Jewish music, film music, American music, and ethnomusicology theory. 2 of his books have received the very coveted ASCAP Deems Taylor Award. One book is Fiddler on the Move, Exploring the Klezmer World, and the second book is Tenement Songs, Popular Music of Jewish Immigrants. He has been president of the Society for Ethnomusicology and the Society for Asian Music. He retired in 2016 after 45 years at Wesleyan University and lives in Manhattan. And we're glad to say that Professor Mark Slobin has been a part of many of our events this year, and we're very grateful for his wonderful scholarly insights. So our presentation will first be by Dr. Daniela Smolev-Levy, followed by Professor Slobin's comments, and then we really look forward to some lively conversation. So, Dr. Smolev-Levy.
Thank you so much, Mark, for that introduction, and thank you again for providing this fantastic opportunity to present all this research. It's really wonderful to have an audience to share this with, and thank you also to Mark Slobin for agreeing to participate. It's an honor to have him here. His work has been a foundation for not only my work, but obviously many, many other people. So I'll begin by sharing my screen so you can see my presentation. Everybody see the screen?
Yep.
Yes, great, thank you. Okay. So how do you say bravo in Yiddish? Italian opera for the Yiddish-speaking masses in early 20th century America. In the 5th part of the series, I'm entitling Why Promote Italian Opera via Mameloshen. And Mameloshen is just a Yiddish word for mother tongue, which refers to the Yiddish language. So in the first 4 lectures, we were zooming in, so to speak, on the activity of Yiddish speakers in the opera world, shedding light on some previously unknown involvement of this public in the world of opera in the United States in early 20th century America. So today, rather than using a microscope to look in detail, my goal is to zoom out to a bird's eye view to take in as much as possible the whole landscape of Yiddish speakers' involvement in and understanding of opera in early 20th century America. The real test, as I see it, of how widespread Yiddish speakers' involvement with opera really was, will be by looking not just for our keys under the lamppost, but also in places where Jews might not obviously be likely to experience opera, such as in theaters, obviously is the place where you'd expect them, but we need to look elsewhere, places not illuminated by the lamppost in other cultural contexts, both high and low, secular and sacred. And scholars like Mark Slobin, Jeffrey Chandler, and Judah Cohen have pointed to the role of opera in the world of cantorial singing. And as we'll see, there was opera in many other places as well. So the question for today is to consider where opera could be found in Yiddish-speaking circles, and to think about why there was such a presence of European language opera, Italian, French, Russian, German, among those who spoke Yiddish, again, just to recap, known as the Mama Russian. So in the first lectures, we looked at some of these, and I've also included a few other endeavors that were performed, that were opera performances aimed at Yiddish speakers in theaters, both mainstream theaters as well as Yiddish theaters in languages ranging from Yiddish to Italian, French, Polish, German, Russian. This is, not a surprising place necessarily. You might expect to see opera, if it was going to be performed anywhere, it'd be performed in theaters. And these are some examples of companies that did do European language opera aimed at Yiddish speakers. Just want to briefly note that although the lectures have focused on opera in America, there was certainly a world of a performance of opera aimed at Yiddish speakers, certainly in Europe, and as well, including performances in Yiddish. And these are just a couple of libretti published in Yiddish, just to note that that is also another interesting aspect of this question as well. So in addition to opera in foreign languages, or what we consider non-English, Yiddish speakers also appear to have had exposure to English language popular price opera in this same time period. There's a reference to the very successful Castle Square Opera Company run by Henry Savage in 1904. So we suspect that Yiddish speakers might have known about that as well. And there were many ads for and reviews of the Century Opera Company, for which one of the conductors was Josiah Zuro, who of course was the impresario of the Zuro Opera Company that had a successful 5-year stint on the Lower East Side. And we also see ads in all the major Yiddish papers for the all-Black Theodore Drury English language Grand Opera Company in 1906. Just an interesting historical aside here, photos of the main singer, an impresario of the troupe, Theodore Drury, and one of the lead female singers. And here you can see ads for the performance, some of the performances, and an interesting crossover between cultural spheres was the instance where the European Russian-born Jewish opera singer Julian Bolensky performed with the Drury Company in the lead roles of Aida and Carmen for a few performances as well. He had been brought over, here you can see, he's here in the bottom right, he'd been brought over by the Schund Theater producer, playwright Moshe Horowitz in 1904 to perform opera in Yiddish translation in the Windsor Theater on the Lower East Side. And he stayed on to do various other kinds of musical theatrical engagements. And so this was, the Theodore Drury Company was one of them. One wonders what language he might have sung in, but in any case, interesting blending of cultural spheres. Now, Yiddish speakers who didn't attend fully staged opera performances, either in regular opera houses or in Yiddish theaters, would also have heard operatic music in other contexts, as I noted, high and popular, secular, and sacred. And the secular popular sphere, they would have heard it in the Yiddish theater. As I mentioned, I think a couple of lectures ago, it was incorporated into the musical language of much of the most popular historical operettas in the Yiddish theater, often including clear quotations from famous European operas, as well as just the general Italian operatic style. And there were also publications of sheet music of easy arrangements of popular operatic favorites as well. So these are some other ways that Yiddish speakers would have been engaging with and hearing European opera. Yiddish speakers also heard the operatic style in the sacred sphere. As I mentioned, as Mark Sullivan has mentioned, as his research and others as well, there were a lot of similarities between cantorial singing and operatic singing, not only in training, but also in the actual voice production and in the virtuosic melismatic embellishments that both sets of singers engaged in. And of course, there were many singers who performed in both spheres. We'll get into a little bit in a moment. The evidence for the closeness of these two spheres of musical performance can be seen in this cartoon from 1909 from the Grosser Kundes, where the caption to this cartoon reads, "In the old country, he was a cantor and was called Zelikovich. In America, he is an Italian tenor and is called Signor Zelconini." You can see this, this juxtaposition of the two. And in fact, many cantors did cross over into the secular sphere to varying degrees. They sang operatic arias in concert and on recordings, sometimes in Yiddish. Three of the most famous cantors of this late 19th, early 20th century period, Yossel Rosenblatt, Gershon Sirota, and Joseph Schmidt, were all known as the Jewish Caruso. And there's a famous story of Caruso telling Sirota that he was relieved that he wasn't in the opera world because he didn't want the competition. And as you can see here, there are ads for a notice of the upcoming concert that Sirota was going to give in 1912 in Carnegie Hall, which was part of a tour he was making across the United States. And you can see, the nature of the promotion and the inclusion of operatic arias along with liturgical music. And one of the arias he sang in this concert was Verdi's, or the aria from Verdi's opera Aida called Celeste Aida. And so we'll listen to a recording of him singing that here. Oh, just you can, I put the photo side by side, just like the cartoon. It's pretty easy to see how the cartoon would have come to be with this sort of standard iconography of the Italian opera singer in the top hat and the cantor in his traditional garb. Pause it there. Opera's dangerous allure for cantors was also frequently discussed in Jewish circles. This cartoon here from 1918 of Yossel Rosenblatt running from the indecent Grand Opera Maiden refers to the famous incident in 1918 when Rosenblatt was famously offered the opportunity to sing in La Juive with the Chicago Opera Company. And with much publicity, he ended up refusing the offer, but the offer itself was emblematic of this long-standing tension of cantors, being drawn to the appeal of the lucrative opera world, but also being held back by the immorality and the indecency of some of the operatic performances of the actual operas and of the whole associated theatrical world. This topic appears famously in The Jazz Singer, as well as the film The Jazz Singer with Al Jolson and the Yiddish film from 1940, Der Wilner Balabessel, known in English as Overture to Glory, which are both drawn based on the same short story that that tells the story of a cantor who is conflicted and in his desire to become part of the Warsaw Opera Company, Warsaw Opera. We also see some musicians going the other way, from being opera singers to later becoming cantors, and in all their performances exposing Yiddish speakers to operatic performances of all kinds. You can see here ads for the Russian Jewish baritone Joseph Vinogradov, who original name was Joseph Weinstein, whom we met briefly in the third lecture in this series as a singer with a Russian and European operatic career that was in some ways similar to Medvedev's. Vinogradov performed in many concerts in his time in America. He came over in 1920 and gave a whole series of recitals all across the country in these mixed genre concerts like the one you can see here. These mostly joint recitals that combined operatic excerpts with all manner of other kinds of musical and theatrical elements, including just classical instrumental music, as well as Yiddish folk songs, recitations from the Yiddish theater, liturgical music, sometimes some political speeches. He also did liturgical music, sometimes actually doing joint recitals with Yosela Rosenblatt. And he also performed even in a jazz concert, which we'll get to in a moment. It's interesting to see here at the bottom of the English language version of the program an ad for another cantor doing concerts, Cantor Hirschman, who also was known for performing opera. Vinogradov performed opera, as I mentioned, in other genres in the popular sphere. Here, an ad and a program for Joseph Chernyavsky and his Yiddish American Jazz Band. And you can see this mixed concert of jazz and a variety of Jewish music, and included, among other things, Vinogradov singing his signature cavatina from Rossini's Barber of Seville. And he sang this one usually in Yiddish, sometimes in Italian. Here he's doing it in Yiddish. And I played a recording of him in the third lecture. But these are all available easily online at the Library of Congress if you're curious to hear them. Vinogradov also performed in the Yiddish theater. He became quite known for his role in Goldfaden's Bar Kochba. And as I mentioned, he later became a cantor. Here's an ad for performances of the High Holiday, for the High Holidays. So let's listen to Vinogradov singing one of the songs he sang at both the jazz concert I showed you an ad for, and in several of the other concerts that he gave. This is a Yiddish folk song from around 1913. The recording is later, but the song was written around that time. Pause it there. It's just interesting to see that a figure like Vinogradov could have moved between so many different kinds of cultural contexts, singing such different kinds of music, which to me suggests that there was a much closer affinity than you might expect between the style of singing of these folk songs and opera, suggesting a kind of acceptance of a general aesthetic that was that made opera fit into this whole cultural context much more than you would perhaps expect. Yiddish speakers also heard opera in very, very clearly popular contexts, such as the ad here for a picnic and concert that was being held at Liberty Park in New York in 1902. So obviously an extremely informal kind of setup. There was the ad notes that you can come to the park as early as 2 o'clock and have a good time, and then the concert's at 7. They also advertise a raffle, and the tickets are only 20 cents, which was cheap by the standards of the time. The cheapest ticket to the Yiddish theater, which practically everybody could afford, was 25 cents. So 20 cents is even less than that. And this concert features, among other things, both instrumental and vocal excerpts from operas including Faust, Carmen, Diem and La Juive, and Galka. And it's interesting to note that this Professor Spielberg, who was involved in this concert, which was sponsored by the Kishinev Revolutionary Organization of the Bund, this Spielberg was involved in other politically motivated musical events organized by the Bund, which was a prominent and often controversial political organization that wanted to help the Russian Jews fight against the oppression of the Tsarist regime. So these concerts were often had a political side as well. But it's interesting that they would have used opera as what they perceived as a fitting kind of music to perform at these sorts of things. Spielberg, Mark Slobin notes in his Tenement songs, I have to mention this, I was so delighted to find Spielberg somewhere else, that he was also involved in 1905 concert that included sung operatic music by Hillel Vichnin, who also translated operatic libretti into Yiddish in 1908. These are concerts much like the ones I was just showing with Vinogradov that included not only opera, but also instrumental music. There was a violinist in this 1905 concert who played arrangements of opera arias. There were dramatic declamations. There was a ball. So it's just, these are all obviously part of this broader trend of having these musical events that combined different cultural and social and political aspects of the lives of Yiddish speakers. And you can see all these figures, these musicians and journalists and political activists all involved in all these different spheres with similar goals, even though the contexts are often quite different. Actually, we see this political side also in performances or in concerts that Vinogradov participated in the 1920s, all of which had some opera. There was a whole series of mixed genre concerts celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Vorwärts, which was one of the, if not the leading Yiddish newspaper of the time, which is known for being, as were practically all the newspapers, very left-leaning with socialist ideology that held among its cultural beliefs that high culture, of which opera was seen as a part, was an important tool for using to help uplift the Jewish masses, the Yiddish-speaking immigrants. So by exposing them to high culture, you would help them, fight for their rights and get them involved in these loftier goals and help them assimilate and get accustomed to life in America. So you see these concerts sponsored by this organization that reflect these ideals. There was also a concert that Vinogradov participated in, sponsored by the Jewish Teachers Seminary, which explicitly stated on the Yiddish version of its program that its goal was to, quote, propagate general education, which the word they used there is Bildung, and enlightenment, Aufklärung, among the Jewish working masses. Yiddish speakers could also read plenty about opera if they were so inclined. In addition to the copious reporting in the newspapers, which we've seen over the course of these lectures, these newspapers reported on practically everything operatic, everything from the, who was at the dock to meet the newest singer who was singing at the Met or the Manhattan, to articles like this one in Die Jiddische Bühne from 1909 that compared Caruso and Bonci, two of the leading singers at the time, as a reference at the end of the article to how there are many heated debates among Yiddish speakers among Yiddish speakers as to who of the two was better. So again, suggesting that there was more than passing interest among Yiddish speakers in opera. You can see here also an article from Die Zukunft, which is a kind of high-tone literary magazine. It's an article about Verdi, biography. There's also an article a few years later about Louise, which is opera on a working class topic. And then this on the right-hand side is the front page for William Edlin's world famous operas from 1907, which is a book of synopses in Yiddish of some of the most famous Italian, French, and German operas, which itself was a collection of some of the synopses that he published in the Yiddish weekly paper Der Amerikaner. So these are just a few examples of the different places where Yiddish speakers would have read about opera. There are many other examples I could get into it. I don't want to take too much time. And then another place where Yiddish speakers would have heard opera would have been obviously on recordings, as I mentioned, made by many cantors, both in the original language and in Yiddish. And of course, there were lots of cheap opera records by non-Jewish singers. In 1929, there was this intriguing opera on the radio program, the Robert Burns Yiddish Stunde, which gave abridged versions of opera in Yiddish, advertised in the forwards, as you can see here, as operas in Yiddish. And of course, opera shows up as a theme in film, as in the case of the 1940 movie I mentioned earlier. That all takes us to the question that we began, was why promote Italian opera, French, Italian, German, European language opera in Yiddish? And the basic answer, as far as I can see, as there were sort of two main groups of people among Yiddish speakers that are kind of neatly summarized in this 1911 review article of the Zero Company. They describe them as connoisseurs, mabinim, and beginners. So we can see that the prevalence of opera among Yiddish speakers can partly be explained as a simple response to demand. There were connoisseurs, people who came from cultures with strong traditions of opera going, and these people already liked opera and knew about it and were eager to continue going in America. And of course, popular price companies were especially interested in targeting these audiences because there were many in this group who either couldn't afford to attend elite-oriented opera or felt marginalized in that context. Remember that cartoon from 1907 of all the elites with their diamonds and their furs making all that noise, and all the true opera lovers were in the upper reaches of the balcony and the galleries in the standing room who were leaning forward trying to hear the opera, and they couldn't. So these were these true opera lovers, among whom were many of these Yiddish-speaking immigrants who wanted to hear the opera and felt marginalized. So all these opportunities gave them more chances to hear it on their own terms. But in addition to this group, there's clearly a perception that there was a group of beginners in this group of Yiddish speakers who wanted to learn about opera. For them and for the cultural elites who were interested in uplifting them, opera appealed as a particularly useful tool of cultural uplift, in part because it was familiar to them. Even if they weren't necessarily opera goers in their home country, they would have still certainly known about it. And in America, opera was widely seen by both Jews and non-Jews as an elite art form that could confer edification, refinement, and uplift. In this progressive era's belief in high culture's power to uplift audiences paralleled also ideals motivating the turn of the century reform movement in the Yiddish theater, which held that exposing audiences to serious culture could help refine their sensibilities and make them more enlightened people. And of course, this also dovetailed with the ideology of Aufklärung I mentioned earlier, part of socialist circles that were so integrated into the Yiddish-speaking environment of the time. And there were, of course, many free lectures and programs that were offered by organizations like the Educational Alliance and the Board of Education that further reveal an institutional commitment to uplifting Jewish immigrants through high culture like opera. So I'd suggest that opera's resonance for Yiddish speakers can perhaps be attributed to its ability to reconcile the old world with the new. It straddled tradition and modernity by simultaneously representing familiar European culture on the one hand and prestige and refinement in the American mainstream in the other. So consumption of opera could be as much a marker of assimilation and acculturation as of adherence to European roots. In the case of opera aimed at Yiddish-speaking audiences, further reveals the complicated and symbiotic relationship between the high and popular cultural spheres of the early 1900s. Although in theory, the categorizations of musical genres as highbrow or popular had already become relatively fixed and quite widely recognizable by the early 20th century, in practice, as we've seen, these genres mixed freely in multiple cultural contexts. This suggests to me that a similar musical aesthetic pervaded these various spheres, high and popular, secular and sacred, despite differentials in prestige and target audience. This particular story might look like it has nothing to do with the present. There are hardly any Yiddish speakers left. Hebrew has replaced Yiddish as the common language of the Jews. Jews are no longer a recent immigrant in America, and opera no longer has the same cultural relevance it once did. But the story we've explored over these last 5 lectures about European opera aimed at the Yiddish-speaking masses in early 20th century America is merely one version of a story of how immigrants who have continued to come to America from many other countries and cultures use culture to negotiate the challenges of adjusting to a new environment. It's a story that continues to be retold of how people balance the inevitable tension between the pull of assimilation on the one hand and the desire to preserve a unique cultural heritage on the other. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. And now, Mark Slobin.
Well, I'd like to start by expressing my gratitude to Daniela for putting a large piece in a missing piece in the jigsaw puzzle that is our understanding of Jews in the immigrant era in the United States. This is a piece we didn't have so nicely, fitting into place to help bring out this picture. I want to flesh this out with a few other points. I think all of her points are really valid and useful. I'd like to start by zooming out a little bit to think about popular culture and how it works in the United States in general. Anything having to do with Jews, let's say, in America, is at the intersection of two timelines, a Jewish timeline, which has been going for, a couple thousand years maybe, and an American timeline, which is maybe seems more recent. So a figure like the Cantor, for example, is an extremely old line that is meeting the idea of a modern society like the United States, which isn't very old. Popular culture in the United States, compared to its spread among the Jews, is, however, rather similar in time and in meaning. For the United States, popular culture is what holds a place together. This is one of the major things that distinguishes the United States from Europe, where you have national cultures. In America, we didn't. We have a patchwork of cultures and what I, in my work, have called the superculture, a kind of umbrella over everybody. And popular culture is the main umbrella in the United States. And in the 19th century, that included opera as popular culture. With the advent of lithography and the widespread of sheet music, starting around the 1840s, you get an enormous spread of forms of popular culture with magazines, sheet music, the spread of pianos as an industrially mass-produced object, which went into homes, which were understood to be meant for feminization of the home and to be played by girls. Then you have the transport network of trains going across the continent that could take musicians and jugglers and whoever else on train cars and stopping in every single place across America, no matter how small, bringing popular culture. So this supercultural quality of popular culture is distinctively American, and the Jews then are coming into a situation where it's entirely normal for them to participate in this because this system was open to immigrants. So first it's the Irish in the 1840s and thereafter who not only come in but eventually take over American popular culture and popular music in many ways, and the theater tradition and the theater chains and the vaudeville chains. And then the Jews do this when they come to America. So we're talking partly about a capitalized, commodified system, in addition to matters of taste, and what the masses get to see. These are all really interesting issues. I don't have time to unpack that much. But let me just speak to the issue of opera. So if they stopped in a small town in Nebraska or Idaho, they would put on opera arias across America. It was understood to be an extremely democratic form. The girls playing the pianos were playing tons of opera arias on their piano. Okay. So the idea that opera is somehow for the elite is really very late. It's a Gilded Age invention when the elites want to start separating themselves. So the construction of the Metropolitan Opera House is very deliberately built so it's only for elites. And this is a kind of thing. And this is most celebrated in a book by Lawrence Levine that's about 40 years old called Highbrow and Lowbrow. Lately there's been, more recently there was critiques of that saying, opera never really went away as something for the masses, which I think is in Daniela's work very clearly. In fact, in 1909, there was an American magazine called the American Magazine that asked people to send in their favorite song of whatever description. And the book was called Heart Songs Dear to the American People, and there's Verdi in there, okay, in 1909. So it isn't just for some kind of people wearing gowns and furs. So that's sort of an interesting thing. Or Willa Cather's novel, The Song of the Lark, which shows a girl from deep out in the steppes and prairies who becomes a diva in Chicago. And she was able to get that training where she was. Now, the Jews had been thinking about opera as part of popular culture and as upward mobility very far back in Europe even, and were beginning to create a popular culture of their own not that long after Americans were doing, in terms of something capitalized, widespread, and on a network of even like train networks and things like that. For example, way back in 1830s, the governor of Odessa writes to the Tsar complaining that the Jews had bought up all the opera tickets. I mean, that's a long time ago. Okay. So, they're really invested in this thing for whatever reasons. And in Odessa, they're mixing it with cantorial music already and the training of cantors. So this is not something that they, oh my God, we're in America, now we have to, discover opera. It's in the blood, so to speak. And as Danielle has pointed out, Goldfaden in, say, 1878 is using a Verdi aria for his most famous opera or operetta, Shalamas. But the point is, though, that nobody knew it was from Verdi, da, da, dee, da, da, da. It then becomes a Goldfaden song. So it goes right into popular culture. And so the idea that it's always upward mobility is not, I think, necessarily the case. Or the question of voice quality, which I think you raised very aptly. If you listen to recordings of the oldest Yiddish folk singers we have, and opera, and people that were kids in 19-teens, and listen to opera performance of the same kind, I used this a long time ago as an example, the Schubert Serenade, which is kind of a classical piece, sung by one of our great singers, Elizabeth Schechter-Widmann, and then as sung by Jussi Björling, who was born around the same time. They have a very similar approach to how to sing Schubert. There is an overlap of aesthetic, as you point out, that kind of muddies the waters in a way beyond the sort of issue of class distinctions. So that's one sort of area I wanted to mention. And music, though, as mobility and as a way for Jews to cross boundaries is really an important point to make. And it never goes away. I also want to mention that some of the trends you're talking about continued down into my lifetime, even though it looks like perhaps, this whole syndrome was gone. In my research for my book on Detroit, in music in Detroit in the 1940s and 50s, it was very, very clear that the Jews' investment in classical music in Detroit, including opera, was very intense, and it was partly a way for them to reach across barriers, because Detroit was probably the most anti-Semitic city in America. They were able to use their leaders in music, and their taste and understanding to cross the kinds of boundaries. And that's, 1940s and 50s. So it's even way beyond the immigrant age that this kind of thinking of the Jews, who are still kind of on the defensive, and even though supposedly they're assimilated into American life, are going to keep doing that sort of activity. And as far as cantors and opera, when I was doing the research for the history of the American cantorate in the 1980s, one cantor said to me, well, I studied opera, in the Geneva Conservatory, and I said, how is it you became a cantor, And he said, I studied opera, and it was clear to me that I really wasn't going to be a major opera star. And I had a colleague in the, a classmate who was an Italian. And then when it was clear to him that he wasn't going to become an opera star, he threw himself into Lake Geneva, he said. But me, I could just become a cantor, with the skills that I had. So, this kind of idea of going through, and this is, again, post-World War II, and he's thinking of these two worlds as overlapping in a way, and that he has this choice, this choice that he can make. I'll make just two more quick points. One is when I did Tenement Songs, which is now literally 40 years old, I tried to get comparative data from other ethnic groups in America about their popular music and their culture. And there was zero literature. And there still is almost no literature for any other American ethnic group about their musical evolution. It's really still shocking. But it's clear, though, that the Italians were always interested in opera as a popular culture for them, dating back to the 1840s and 50s and singing Verdi arias in the streets, in Italy. This was also happening, I think, in New York. I wish we knew more so we could put the Jewish case in a context. And of course, there would be Italians who would be crossing back and forth that way as well. Another point I want to make is about this eclecticism and the opportunism of performers who will move into any niche that's open to them. When you were describing Medvedev, I was thinking of a guy with a somewhat similar name, David Medov. And Medov, or who was also known as Medovi, was a immigrant to the Lower East Side who was in the Yiddish stage. But then he made recordings of Ukrainian and Russian stuff in those languages, and very opportunistic. And I wrote an article about this with Richard Spotswood a long time ago. And there was this wonderful moment in the article, in our research, where from the Forverts, where they describe Medov, and they describe Ukrainian immigrants in the wilds of Canada who are sitting around the gramophone, singing along piously to Orthodox religious music. And they say, and they're repeating every word, this is a quote, they're repeating every word after the priest, Reb David Medov, so piously, so religiously. At the same time, he is sitting in his house in New York, in his Jewish house, eating kosher delicacies. So there's even the kind of this celebration, this kind of very snide way of the crossover possibilities and of making a career by being extremely eclectic, even if you're going off into Orthodox liturgical selections. So there's a lot here that is, I think, extremely very rich, and maybe we can have some discussion and some questions about all this. But I think it's important to always look for the continuities, and the similarities, as well as what should be kind of disjunctures, or what happens when you get radical dislocation in historical episodes, particularly among the Jews. There's more stability in a way than always than one thinks at first. So thanks for your work.
Thanks, Mark.
Daniela, would you like to make some comments?
Sure. Yeah, no, I really like the branching out that Mark is providing, and it sheds light on a lot of these related issues that are so important to understanding the particular topic we're looking at. You can't possibly understand opera and Yiddish speakers without understanding this broader context, because you don't know if what you're observing in this context is different or if it's the same as what's going on elsewhere. So you can't know if it's distinctive or similar. And I think the point that I would underscore that I think is so important and is worth, I think, clarifying. So I'm glad that Mark brought it up, which is that opera did have an extremely lively existence, before it became, highbrow. It had this incredibly vibrant, part. It was an incredibly vibrant part of explicitly popular culture in the 19th century, both in America and Europe. And Levine's book really sheds important light. And yes, it's gotten a lot of critique lately, but I still think the fact that he just pointed out this incredible diversity and this vibrancy is the word, the robustness of this operatic culture is really worth underscoring. And what's interesting is the point that he makes, which is that, yes, opera was part of popular culture, but until this, late 19th, early 20th century period, there was no separate context of popular culture. There was just culture that people from all social classes participated in, and they found different ways of differentiating themselves through venue, or through certain kinds of singers, or using certain languages in the case of opera. So there were certainly structures and formats of differentiating, high class audiences from lower class audience, but the content was, including opera, was very much shared. And the creation of the Metropolitan Opera in 1883 and the whole erection of the notion of high culture that was solidified by other institutions like the Boston Symphony Orchestra and other institutions of the time that were kind of branched off that, were conscious, elite-driven efforts to find a way of solidifying themselves as an elite class and separating themselves. Since they were finding cultural ways of doing so, they had to prove their social bona fides, so to speak, especially the nouveau riche, who were these industrial capitalists, people like J.P. Morgan, who were coming into money without any kind of fancy breeding or a distinguished aristocratic name or the equivalent in America. This is new money. And so how did they prove themselves? They had to show that they were refined. And opera was one of the ways of doing that. And of course, because opera was, it had aristocratic associations from its European origins, as well as a popular following. It's a particularly useful tool for American elites. So they really marshaled it for their own social purposes. But as many have pointed out, they didn't really succeed entirely because it was so ingrained in popular culture. And so you see this interesting tension in opera, which is, I think, what drew me to the topic in the first place, that it's both elite and popular. And how does that work? It's both extremely prestigious and the tickets are so expensive. And if you're anybody, you've got to show up at the opera, or at least used to. Versus the fact that, the quote unquote true elites, they look down on opera. Oh, it's too splashy. It's not really serious. If you're a real, connoisseur, you go to chamber music, you go listen to Beethoven. None of this, blood and thunder stuff. So there's interesting, tension there within the elite world. And so that's why I think it was such a useful tool. Why, not so much necessarily a tool, that's maybe describing too much agency, but that's why it was such a pervasive force, let's say, in the cultural world, both of Jews and non-Jews in this time period, because it has this legacy, as Mark points to, of being incredibly popular, but also has this cachet sort of developed by force, you might say, through its association with elites in these fancy opera houses with their diamonds and their conspicuous consumption of something like that and promoting it as something European, which distinguished the popular consumption of opera in English language in the United States versus the elite opera. And there are all kinds of interesting language issues there. But my point here is just to underscore the fact that it's part of the reason I think it persists the way it does and it is so pervasive is because it both appeals in these elite circles as a kind of high culture form and is appealing to popular audiences in part because of that, because many people did aspire to what was known as elite culture. But it also had this fun side, and people already liked opera, many of them, and it was also embedded in popular culture. So that's why it could work. And the very last thing I'll say is that it is certainly the case, and something that I'd like to do more research on is to understand the prevalence of opera within popular culture in the United States more broadly. Certainly, we know it was, undoubtedly, unambiguously popular and widespread in the mid to late 19th century. By the early 20th century, it seems to be, maybe becoming more separated, but you do still see things like this Vilensky singer I pointed to earlier, who went to I believe it was Colorado, Denver. I think he ran the opera company there. And you see concerts they were giving of a similar type where they do some light classical music, they do some opera excerpts. It's kind of a picnic or an outdoor summer park experience. So there you find ways of, you see blends of opera and more obviously popular culture in the non-Jewish sphere as well. So I'll stop there. But thanks so much again, Mark, for participating and being such an incredible force in this field for all of us.
Well, yeah, and don't forget the Bugs Bunny cartoons, which takes us down to the 40s and 50s,
Yes.
where somehow opera still enough a reference that for these mass audience they could do spoofs of opera and singers and things like that.
Absolutely.
And the whole struggle in the 1930s and 40s musicals between jazz and opera, which is a leitmotif, a major theme through the American musical, straight through. But opera then is still the foil, for American culture. Yeah, that goes on a really long time, surprisingly.
So we have time for several questions. I know some hands were raised, and there's a question in the chat. So if anyone has a question, we welcome you to raise your hand or put something in the chat, and we're happy to
Well,
share
as far as non-Jewish singers singing in Yiddish or chazonas, I mean, this goes down through, Connie Francis and Perry Como and every single, non-Jewish musician singing Kol Nidre. I mean, there's been, whole studies of that, which we had in the earlier sessions at the here at UCLA on the history of Kol Nidre. There's always been that interest of crossover into the Jewish world using a couple of, that particular selection, for example.
Thank you, Mark. Any other questions? Perhaps while people are formulating some questions, I'll take the liberty to ask a couple. So, it seems the theme of the discussion today is just the pervasiveness of how a sense of highbrow, lowbrow, or high culture, low culture is not the measurement. The way it exists today is not the measurement really of this time period. And it really occurs to me the way that you presented this, Daniela, of, the cantor slash opera singer, or superstar cantor, superstar opera singer, or the work of the big concert promoters to really go to really bigger venues and make it affordable. And I know from Samantha Cooper's work that there's this effort to bring opera to, baseball stadiums and to really big arenas. And I'm just curious, to what extent are these, purely American phenomenon, in these measurements of cantor to opera singer and this venue kind of like elaboration? How much is American, or what's really happening in Europe, or to, to like Jewish experiences in other countries at this time?
I can take a crack a little bit at that. I think Mark is probably in a better position to answer that. But I think that my understanding is that there was a whole, star cantor persona that certainly existed in Europe that pervaded, all social classes. I think it wasn't. I guess I don't know to what extent cantors were, I don't think there was really an equivalent to stadia, the Hippodrome in the United States. I don't know what the equivalent would be in Europe, but they certainly drew large audiences. I don't know, Mark, if you, I'm sure you have like to shed on that.
Different stages in Europe. Before 1939, you have this transatlantic traffic. So Sirotto is not an American cantor or a Polish cantor. He's constantly on the boat back and forth. And unfortunately, he was in Warsaw in 1943 and perished. But there was this network, and these people would tour all over the place. The Jewish performers, it would be in various countries, Latin America, so there was a large traffic in that. I don't think, as far as how many Jews in Europe ended up on the concert and the opera stage, actually, I don't know that history, how that works out. But then you get, the war, and so the Jews are gone, in any case. So it becomes, less and less possible for crossover careers like that. But in America, we just have to look at Richard Tucker and Jan Pierce, who have extraordinary opera careers, and who are constantly making a ton of money doing services in the Catskills. I think, what was it Tucker earned in the 1950s? Something like $30,000 for doing Pesach in the Catskills. Some extraordinary amounts of money people were willing to pay for an opera singer being, doing something Jewish. So in that way, it's kind of it's a reverse crossover in a certain kind of way once the Jews get established like that on the American opera stage after World War II. It's another phase of the history.
But to your knowledge, were European cantors also singing opera?
Actually, I don't know.
Well, one thing that I have seen thus far is that, although certainly not all cantors did opera, practically every Jewish opera singer had some cantorial training. So if you were from any kind of a Jewish environment, your original training would have been as a mishoyer, as a choir singer, and you would have been trained by cantors. And then that is sort of the font for pretty much any kind of musical career in the Jewish world, whether you're in the Yiddish theater, either with even not just composers but also singers and some of the playwrights, and of course any opera singers practically all, as far as I can see, Jewish opera singers got their training with cantor. So it all started there, and then some of them became opera singers and came back. Some of them just became cantors, but there was a lot of movement between spheres and also with the Yiddish theater as well.
Yeah, I've never seen a systematic study for Europe of how many cantors actually made appearances on the opera stage. I think they certainly. I mean, we know they integrated cantorial singing into their voices and into the compositions they wrote, but how many of them actually, got on the boards on opera stages in Europe? I actually have not seen a history of that.
Thank you. Zachary Baker just posed a question.
Oh, that's for Daniela, right? Did Jewish women sing in these opera companies? Right.
Yes, certainly. The short answer is yes. Yes, they did. And of course, they wouldn't have had cantorial training, but many of them sort of did grow up, obviously, in religious settings and knew a lot of the, knew the style, and some sang in Berda Kalish. I think did a lot of singing in those contexts, and also, sang a little bit in the opera and toyed with even going into the opera world, and supposedly was talked out of it because she was told she might have to play, a non-Jewish person on stage and might have to do, morally questionable things on stage. And so she was enticed into the Yiddish theater world, much to its benefit, you might say. And there were also other singers. I'm blanking on her name right now. There's Regina Prager also. I think I may have gotten them backwards, but she also had some kind of opera training and came from, a religious background. My sense is that obviously the training that women received was much less formalized by and large than the men. And some of the biggest names in the Yiddish theater in both America and Europe had some kind of, some of them who could afford it had some conservatory training. So that's, and of course there were other singers who were like the ones that came over from Europe to America, who had, regular operatic careers, who were of Jewish extraction, but didn't necessarily have strong, or at least publicly strong, Jewish ties. I don't know the nature of their religious involvement, but there were certainly a number of singers who came over with the 1904 group with Moshe Horowitz, who sang. And of course, there are many famous, elite world opera singers as well, who were Jewish. But I think because there was a less obvious, public sphere for them in the religious sphere, there's not so much understanding maybe, or such obvious overlap with the sacred sphere.
Well, there's a shift of aesthetics too, though, within the Yiddish opera or operetta. I mean, the whole other thing we could talk about is, what is an opera and what is an operetta, and this is actually pretty important to try to distinguish and talk about the overlaps of those two genres. But within the Yiddish operetta, there's this shift done by Joseph Rumshinsky, who comes as an immigrant, I think, in 1906 and is very well trained, who just can't bear the low quality of the voices on the Yiddish stage, because every Yiddish theater had songs, every Yiddish play had songs, but they were mostly sung by actors who didn't have voices, and so his idea was to raise the level of the orchestra, make real orchestral arrangements, have singers who could really hit the notes. And so in some, in the recordings of things that he starts to take over, you can hear that. Somebody like Regina Zuckerberg, these people, they can hit the high notes, and they sound like operetta singers in that particular kind of light style that goes on and on into Hollywood, and which has been sort of lost to us as a domain. The operetta doesn't sort of really exist except in places like Vienna anymore.
Yeah, and certainly, people like Medvedev and other singers like Melanie Gutmann were brought over precisely for that reason before Rumshinsky, as a way of, improving the quality. If you could bring in a star singer, it again shows a similarity of aesthetic between, the operetta singing style, the ideal operetta singing style, and a really well-trained opera singer. You could just bring them in, and they could integrate well enough and be a real draw in that context.
Well, so, it's about upward mobility, but it's also about claiming a space, I mean, the Jews are always trying to claim a parallel space, a parallel quality, because to do tend to be denied, access to elite institutions of any sort, through the 1950s. So they're always trying to do some parallel, like, founding Mount Sinai, or Albert Einstein medical schools because they're, kids couldn't get into Gentile medical schools, and so on. I mean, or taking over hotels that wouldn't allow them to be guests, and exclude Jews as guests and like buy the hotel. I mean, there is this general thing of we want to be as good as anybody else. That's in there, which I'm not sure. In a sense, I think that's slightly different than upward mobility. It's about parity, which is an interesting question in its way.
Thank you. Any other questions? Since I don't see any questions, any final thoughts or comments? Daniel, I don't know if you want to share other research and work that you're doing or anything about the Dybbuk project.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, one thing that has been really interesting in doing the research for this presentation is the more I research this and I'm doing other projects, looking at other singers, or looking at the Dybbuk project work I'm doing, which is focusing on Yiddish operettas, especially looking at Ben Chador right now, just sort of the classic historical operetta, sort of trash entertainment, according to elites anyway, is how all these lines started intersecting. Everybody shows up everywhere. This person was involved in this and also involved in that. And you also see this person here, and you see this issue arising in this context, and then sometimes I don't even know what document I should be making these notes in. Is it in the Ben Chador document or is it in my UCLA lecture document? Just, it showed me how broader this sphere was than I really realized when I first started looking at opera for Yiddish speakers. Oh, look, here's some ads for Parsifal in Yiddish. Who knew? And then you start digging, and so did that. And then, Rumshinsky was even called Crazy Wagner by his musicians because of his desire to, make the orchestra more a more active and a more serious musical element, not just papa accompaniment to somebody's high notes. So I think it's just interesting to see also all these operatic elements woven into the operettas, and just to try to understand how all these cultural forces and aspirations and Yiddish and Jewish and non-Jewish elements all kind of intersect in these cultural endeavors.
Yeah.
Many thanks to you, Daniela, for bringing us a really wonderful topic to us in a rich 5-part series.
Yes, bravo.
We could host you for this. We look forward to much more. And to Mark Slovin, thank you so much for being a part of it and adding some perspective. I want to give my thanks to our wonderful staff at the Lowell Milken Center for Music of American Jewish Experience, to Dr. Lori Black, who's our Associate Director, and to Beth Kramer, our Coordinator Manager, who makes all things happen in every single way. So a big thanks to the two of them. And we really thank all of you for coming to tonight's presentation and to any one, perhaps all 4 prior presentations. We really thank you. So a big thanks, and we just look forward to doing more together. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It's been a real honor. I appreciate it.
A real pleasure.